How did the men of Israel defeat the armies of Benjamin? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Judges on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Judges 20 verses 36 to 48, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Judges 20 verse 36, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Judges 20, beginning at verse 36. So the children of Benjamin saw that they were defeated, and the men of Israel had given ground to the Benjamites because they relied on the men in the ambush whom they set against Gibeah. And the men in the ambush quickly rushed upon Gibeah. The men in the ambush spread out and struck the whole city with the edge of the sword. Now the appointed signal between the men of Israel and the men in ambush was that they would make a great cloud of smoke rise up from the city, whereupon the men of Israel would turn in battle. Now Benjamin had begun to strike and kill about 30 of the men of Israel, for they said, "Surely they are defeated before us, as in the first battle." But when the cloud began to rise from the city in a column of smoke, the Benjamites looked behind them, and there was the whole city going up in smoke to heaven. And when the men of Israel turned back, the men of Benjamin panicked, for they saw that disaster had come upon them. Therefore, they turned their backs before the men of Israel in the direction of the wilderness. But the battle overtook them, and whoever came out of the cities they destroyed in their midst. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, and easily trampled them down as far as the front of Gibeah toward the east. And 18,000 men of Benjamin fell. All these were men of valor. Then they turned and fled towards the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they cut down 5,000 of them on the highways. Then they pursued them relentlessly up to Gittim, and killed 2,000 of them. So all who fell of Benjamin that day were 25,000 men who drew the sword. All these were men of valor. But 600 men turned and fled towards the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they stayed at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. And the men of Israel turned back against the children of Benjamin, and struck them down with the edge of the sword, from every city, men and beasts, all who were found. They also set fire to all the cities they came to. In this chapter, we've been looking at the war that Israel has been waging against the tribe of Benjamin, because that tribe was keeping among it those that had brutally raped a Levite's concubine and left her for dead. At first, the tribe of Benjamin was winning this battle, not because the Lord was with them, but because he was against the children of Israel due to their trust in themselves and not in God. However, once this attitude was corrected, Israel won the battle and routed the armies of Benjamin. In verses 36 to the end of the chapter, what we have for us is an expansion of the victory of Israel over Benjamin that will help segue into chapter 21. What we find in the expansion of this story is that Israel divided itself into 2 companies, the ambush and the rest of the army of Israel. The army of Israel was to draw away the people of Benjamin out of Gibeah, after which the ambush would rush the city of Gibeah before the armies of Benjamin noticed what had happened. Benjamin thought he was winning again, like the 2 previous days of battle, but when they looked back and saw the column of smoke rising from the city, which was a signal to the larger army of Israel to begin fighting in earnest, the Benjamites knew that they were defeated. This tactic sounds very familiar to how the city of Ai was taken back in the book of Joshua, so perhaps the military commanders of Israel hearkened back to that victory in order to come up with their tactics here. The Benjamites panicked when they saw this, and so they fled into the wilderness in order to escape. The battle overtook them, though, and 18,000 men were killed trying to flee. An additional 7,000 men escaped death right there on the battlefield near Gibeah, but were killed on the way to the rock of Rimmon. Only 600 men actually reached the rock of Rimmon, where they stayed for 4 months. We'll see them again in chapter 21. In total, then, 25,000 men of Benjamin fell, which is the rounded off version of the 25,100 men that were recorded to have fallen back in verse 35. If you add the 25,100 who died that day with the 600 who escaped, you get a total of 25,700 men. If you go back to earlier in the chapter, verse 15 said that there were 26,700 men in the armies of Benjamin. What of these 1,000 men? Well, remember, this is war. Just because one wins the battle doesn't mean that you don't suffer casualties, even if God is with you, which in this case he was not. Knowing this, we can deduce that while Israel lost 40,000 men in those first 2 days of battle, Benjamin only lost 1,000. However, in the end, Benjamin was completely decimated, making those 2 first days of victory meaningless in the grand scheme of things. After Israel saw that these men had escaped, the armies of Israel turned to the cities of Benjamin and went against each one of them and killed everyone with the edge of the sword, just as they had treated the Canaanites when they entered Canaan. This was the punishment of God for the utter wickedness that this tribe allowed to live among it. With almost all the men of war in Benjamin now dead and their cities destroyed, it would only be a short matter of time until the tribe of Benjamin was completely extinct among Israel. What was to be done? That is what we'll be discussing in the last chapter of Judges, so we invite you back for those discussions. With that, our time is up for today. Tomorrow is Canada Day in Ontario, Canada, so we'll be taking a one-day break and return, the Lord willing, on Saturday, July 2nd, 2022. When we return, we hope you'll join us for our discussion of Judges 21, verses 1 to 15, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.